Welcome, everyone. My name is Robert Rabin, and we are about to embark on an incredibly interesting and important panel conversation, Improving End-of-Life Options, one law at a time, how the passage of a new law and an improvement to another impacts 41.6 million people. We are just so delighted that you've joined us for this important hour. I want to get to our panelists as soon as possible. I will only say that what we are going to talk about today is deeply personal. It's personal for all of us. It's personal for me. It's about something that we will all face, death. It's also a civil rights issue. As Compassion and Choices works to improve and expand end-of-life options, they are also working to make sure that each person has the right to chart your own course toward death. You're about to hear from some of the most experienced and influential leaders in the United States of America fighting hard for our rights. I am so honored to join them and to be a part of that number. Let me bring them on now. Let me introduce the President and CEO of Compassion and Choices, Kim Callanan. Many years with Compassion and Choices after 20 years of visionary leader in civil rights and social movements. Kim started as the Chief Program Officer at Compassion and Choices and now serves as President and CEO. She's a rare leader that has both vision and management, the ability to get programs done. And she's working hard through strategy, improving language, persuasion, fundraising, of course. And the blessing is that Kim, after all these years, she knows the substance of end-of-life care and she knows how to speak to Americans about it. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Robert. What a delight to be here.
We bring on Representative Debbie Armstrong, member of the New Mexico House of Representatives from Bernalillo. She's been in office since, and if I mispronounced that, you're
Bernalillo.
Thank you. Thank you. You think as a native Spanish speaker, I would know that. Been in the House, the New Mexico House since 2015. She chairs Representative Armstrong chairs the Health and Human Services Committee and is an absolute expert in healthcare. She's a licensed physical therapist, was the executive director of the New Mexico Medical Insurers Pool and director of the Agency and Long-Term Services Department for the state of New Mexico under Governor Richardson. Welcome, Representative Armstrong from Bernalillo.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Let me bring on Dan Diaz. Mr. Diaz is many things, but for purposes of today, an activist, a visionary, and a leader. Life brought him, like so many of us, but life brought him terrible tragedy. He's worked with that tragedy, with the facts that life dealt him, and became a crucial guide, narrator, inspirationalist toward sane public policy around end-of-life care. Dan Diaz, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity.
Delighted to have you. And let me welcome member of the board of Compassion and Choices, Dr. Chandana Banerjee, live from Bradbury, California. Dr. Banerjee is a hospice and palliative care, palliative medicine director at City of Hope. She's her expertise is in pediatrics and also end-of-life care, palliative and hospice care, clinical professor, and as I said, board member of Compassion and Choices. Welcome so much, Doctor.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Well, let's get right into it. We have an enormous audience and there's a lot on their mind. Please feel free, if you can, to enter questions in the chat, and we will get to those as soon as possible. So, Kim, let me start with you, the President, CEO of Compassion and Choices. Let's start at the beginning. Not everybody on this webinar knows everything about what we're talking about in the way that you do. What is medical aid in dying? Why is it so important for people at the end of life?
So medical aid in dying, quite simply, is a medical practice that allows a person who is terminally ill but has mental capability to make an informed medical decision and is at the very end of their life. They have a prognosis of 6 months or less to live. They are able to request from their doctor a prescription for medication that allows them to end their suffering if it becomes too great. It's entirely optional. But it's really what we hear from people who want the option is that it brings them tremendous peace of mind simply knowing that the option is available. It really is about the patient having a voice and a choice in the kind of end-of-life care they receive. For many, it is that bodily autonomy issue that you have. I've been in charge of my healthcare decisions my whole life, and now I'm at my death, and I want to be able to be in charge of those decisions before I die as well. The last thing that's really important about it is that after the laws are implemented, what we've seen is that it results in better conversations between doctors and patients, improved palliative care training for doctors, and increased and better use of hospice care. So it doesn't just improve end-of-life care for the person who wants the option, it makes end-of-life care better for everybody.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. And not everybody has equal sort of experience and understanding. Can you give us just sort of the quick history? People have been fighting for these rights for 30 or more years in the United States, and they've been known by different things. Medical aid in dying is what we think is the best descriptor now, but do you want to give us sort of the 60 seconds on how we got here?
Sure. So it started out in back with the ballot initiative in Oregon in 1994, and it's called the Death with Dignity Act. And after a lot of years of work, that law was finally passed. And following Oregon, it was passed 10 years later, also by ballot initiative in Washington State. And from there, we sort of saw a slow plotting Montana and Vermont to follow. And then it was in 2015 when actually Brittany Maynard, Dan's wife, and Dan came forward and shared Brittany's story. She lived in California at the time, wanted the option. He'll tell you more about that. But that really catapulted this movement into the national limelight. And for the last 7 years, 7 states have authorized medical aid in dying. So we now have 1 in 5 Americans lives in a state where medical aid in dying is authorized.
I think sometimes because it was so traumatic, we don't want to talk about it, but during the 90s at the federal level, there were attempts to tell the states they couldn't do this, but the Supreme Court and Congress was unsuccessful at that. And so the sort of the laboratory of the states working to figure out how to improve end-of-life care is really where most of the action is in the United States. So recently there were some big changes, particularly in New Mexico, authorizing medical aid in dying, and California amending their law in a fairly short period of time. Talk to us about what happened and why that's so significant. And in fact, it's the hook for why we're here today.
Sure. I'll give you the brief overview. And then, of course, Representative Armstrong's on the line, and she was our leader in New Mexico, and she can share more. But, since the Oregon law was implemented, really all of the states have been following that approach across every state. And we know that the law works, that it protects patients, but we now have 50 years of combined experience that tells us that there are too many unnecessary regulatory roadblocks that prevent an eligible dying person from being able to access the law. And New Mexico really deserves huge kudos because they were the first state and the first group of lawmakers who stepped back and said, okay, we believe that we should have this law. Now, how do we improve upon the existing Oregon model and correct some of the unnecessary regulatory roadblocks and make it far more accessible? And I was delighted to see them do this tremendous thing and for us to partner with them in making it happen. And I'll let Rev Armstrong share all the exciting news about it.
That's great. Representative Armstrong, I'm going to bring you in a second. I'd like to do a little more sort of context setting. And if we could bring in Dr. Banerjee. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. You sit on the board of Compassionate Choices. You're a well-known palliative care physician. Tell us a little bit sort of on the personal and the professional. Why do you do this work from your perspective? Why is it so important that your patients have this option?
First off, thank you for having me here. This is such a wonderful opportunity to speak to everybody about this amazing topic. So just a little bit about me. I'm a palliative and hospice-trained physician, but I'm also an administrator at one of the cancer centers here. And what drew me to CNC was their wonderful work, not just around medical aid in dying, but around everything end of life care related. They're really the organization that is taking the issues that are relevant in end of life care, not only from education, but also from multiple other aspects to the forefront so that people are educated and make informed decisions. This is really close, near and dear to my heart. As a hospice and palliative pain physician, I see so many patients that come to us without just having all the information necessary to make the appropriate choices at the end of life. And we all know that when it comes to serious illness and terminally ill patients that really have decision-making capacity, that are likely to die within 6 months based on their disease, it's really important for these patients to know all the choices that are at hand for them. And it is really important for them to really have an option such as medical aid in dying that allows them to really have some autonomy over how they die. Mind you, these are patients that are going to be dying due to their disease and their prognoses. Many of these patients, at least I have found, have explored treatment choices and are already receiving hospice and palliative services. And these services are not meeting their symptom burden due to the nature of the disease progression. Sometimes their physical suffering and loss of autonomy through these diseases would really need them to be very heavily medicated so that they become inevitably sedated or in coma. And that really is a poor quality of life that these patients are not expecting at the very end of their lives, when they have really gone through so much with their disease, when they have suffered so much, when the physical ailments are really overburdening their day-to-day living. What we often forget as physicians, and this is where I really hope that other physicians can learn from this, that patients do understand their disease prognoses when it comes to the end of life. They want to maintain a level of autonomy and dignity. These patients don't just wake up one morning deciding to pursue medical aid in dying. They have been thinking about this for a while, along with the other end of life options, and they've been educating themselves. So these patients ultimately, they want peace of mind, and they want to die peacefully rather than lose all their capacity, lose their autonomy, have the immense suffering, whether it's physical, which is primarily what happens in many diseases, or end up in a sedated state which is not their vision of how they want to spend their last days. So it's really important to me that physicians understand this choice, that they respect it, and they start looking at it as the other end of life option, along with the other treatments or the other options that we offer, such as palliative sedation and voluntary stopping of eating and drinking.
Wow. Thank you for all of that. I think you've sort of touched on it, but because you have a global view, you speak at least 4 languages, you work all over the country, you're on the board of the major national organization. What difference are you seeing in the lives of patients in states where medical aid in dying has been legalized versus those where it's not? Are you seeing big culture changes?
I think as with the work we've done with CNC, and as we've educated more and more people across the country, I think it's very clear in the conversations that we have, not only with other physicians, but with other clinicians and also patients that come our way that are really wanting this medical aid in dying act in their states, and the reasons are very simple. I think it's comes down to human dignity and being humans first. I think what happens with not allowing patients to lead a quality of life is us as individuals imposing on really how they need to be living their lives. I don't think we as individuals would want anyone to suffer. That's not the intent. And so to understand that medical aid in dying allows for decreased anxiety, it decreases psychological trauma when it comes to anticipatory grief and other concerns that people might have at the end of life. It decreases patients having to constantly speak to other people and physicians about why they want to have this option. I think all these aspects, including really bringing the conversation to a bigger aspect of advanced care planning and opening that conversation up, are really important when it comes to medical aid in dying with these other states. We find that in states that where medical aid in dying is not yet implemented, the conversations around advanced care planning are still not had as often as they are in these other states. The fact that physicians and patients still haven't had these communications that are very critical at the end of life and in serious illness are lagging in these states that don't have medical aid in dying. So for me, it comes down to really open conversations, communications, advanced care planning, and making sure that the options of end of life are really equitable to all Americans here.
Wow. At the risk of putting words in your mouth, it sounds like your approach is to treat patients like people as opposed to a set of pathologies and diseases. So God bless you for that. Representative Armstrong, let me bring you into this. And on a screen of champions, you're sort of Mount Olympus. You're that amazing person, number one, that is willing to be an elected official. So thank you for that. But you don't just support medical aid in dying. You sponsored the legislation in New Mexico. You took leadership. You did it in 2017, did it in 2019. You've done it in 2021, which I understand is the term in which you announced you're retiring. Talk to us a little bit about why this is such a priority for you.
Well, thank you for the question. And it's a longstanding priority. I started 45 years ago, my first job as a physical therapist, working with terminally ill children. But through the years, I switched more to gerontology, geriatrics, and settled in home health, hospice, long-term care. Great advocate, and then later as a health law attorney and secretary of the Department of Aging. It's all about autonomy and protecting an individual's ability to make decisions for themselves about how they live, what kind of medical care they want or don't want. But personally, I have been the end-of-life caregiver for family and friends, and seen them suffer, regardless of hospice and as much pain medication and other comfort palliative care that we could throw at them just because of the kind of disease they had. But my own daughter, who was diagnosed with metastatic cancer as a teenager, she's now 40, and a health law attorney in her own right, focusing on patient advocacy, patient rights. Had a turn in her cancer a couple of years ago where it is pretty advanced now, brain, liver, lungs, bones. And she's on a clinical trial. Her bones have deteriorated because of side effect of the drugs, and now she's facing multiple joint replacements. She can hardly walk or use one of her arms. She was a strong advocate for this as well. She's been deciding her own healthcare decisions since she was 17. And she has advocated for others making their own healthcare decisions. And this is one she gets to make. She has experienced excruciating pain. She has experienced great difficulty breathing, has been advised to get a trach, doesn't want one yet. And she knows what she's facing at the end, but this is about living. She doesn't want to die. It's not about wanting to die. It's about wanting to live, and to live as long as she can, as well as she can, with as much quality as she can. And then when it's time to be able to do that peacefully, surrounded by her loved ones. And so not only was this a professional important to me, but personally and for her, that I will always advocate for this and do whatever I can to bring about that choice for individuals.
Wow. Millions of Americans are just so lucky to have you and your courage and that of your daughter. Thank you so much for sharing that. When you do this work, as everyone on this screen does, you hear stories, not all as poignant as yours or as forthright. But that's what's going on in real people's lives. And sometimes
It
feels
is all
like,
personal. It's personal.
wow, thank you so much for that. And so I'm going to toggle back and forth between the personal and the policy, because that's what you've chosen to merge in your life as an elected official. Tell us a little bit about the improvements that the New Mexico law, which you led, was able to make. It's from the point of view of those of us in the movement, not only is it wonderful to deliver this relief to New Mexicans who want it, but it also represents an advancement in public policy and a tightening of the laws that we think offer appropriate relief. Sketch us through a little bit what the changes were and how significant they are.
Sure. And thank you to Compassion and Choices and also the National Death with Dignity movement. And we have we looked at other states and what was happening, and knowing New Mexico and knowing our healthcare system, I made a number of changes, and those include a really strong commitment to hospice. And that we specifically include hospice as confirmation that someone has a terminal illness. So it shortcuts a little bit of the consultation. If someone's in hospice, they've already had a medical professionals, physicians affirm that terminal illness. We also in New Mexico have had for 30 years or more independent practice of nurse practitioners, and our physician assistants are within a hair's breadth of independence. And in some communities, that's the only providers. And for many, many people, my family included, it's who they have the closest relationship with as a primary care provider. And so we included nurse practitioners and PAs to be able to prescribe. They have to have a physician affirm eligibility. But again, as I said, if they're on hospice, that's affirmation of that, and they can move forward. The other really big change that we made is that we know that in other states, people are passing during the time that they are supposed to be waiting and or getting consultation. And I don't see the point. And particularly for someone who is at the end of their life, they're suffering, to make them go look for another doctor, to go additional appointments and all of that. I just don't see, when we know they're terminally ill, I don't see what the point is. And so we eliminated a waiting period, other than a very small waiting period at the very end. Once the prescription is written, 48-hour hold to fill, but the prescriber can waive that 48 hours if they feel that the person is at the end and might not survive the 48 hours. So that a time waiting shouldn't be a barrier. And again, with hospice, and most people we know are on hospice, why make them go find yet another provider? And when you're in a very rural, and not just rural, but frontier state, that's hard to come by those consultations necessarily. And if you're sick at the time, it's just hard. We also broadened the who could be a consultant if there is a suspicion of mental illness or disability that might be able to impact your capacity to make the decision. We think a lot of behavioral health is hard to come by in this state as it is. And so we think there's a lot of professionals that have the ability within their scope of practice to determine capacity. And so we've broadened that as well. And there really was just taking out the barriers where we thought they were in other states and matching it to what the reality is in ours.
Like all public policy, it improves with experience. And as people avail themselves of the law, they point out that which works and that which doesn't. So thank you. Thank you so much. I'd actually like to return to some of these details. I think there's a lot of people on the call who really want to get in there around the country and figure out how to improve the policy in their state. And I'm going to ask Kim to speak to that. But let me bring in Dan Diaz. Dan, you were brought to this, we say, movement issue because your wife faced a terminal diagnosis. Not everyone here may be familiar with you and Brittany's story. Not everyone reads every issue of People magazine. Can you share it with us? Can you tell us a little bit about what draw you to it and why you're such a champion?
Sure. So my wife, Brittany Maynard, she died on November 1st of 2014, and there was a lot of media attention around her story. She had been diagnosed with a brain tumor in January of that year. She underwent an 8-hour brain surgery, and shortly thereafter, during the recovery, they were estimating that she had likely 3 to 5 years was the amount of time that she had left on this green earth. Unfortunately, a couple months later, after the first follow-up MRI, the images revealed that the tumor was growing much more aggressively. And they then informed Brittany that 6 months was all the time that she had left. Brittany was only 29 years old. So she's determined to live and live as long as possible. And we're researching every clinical trial that offers any glimmer of hope. But as those trials and different treatment options proved that they would not be viable for her situation, Brittany determined that we would move to Portland, Oregon, that she would take back a little bit of control from that cancer. She was not going to allow cancer or that brain tumor to dictate how much suffering she might have to endure and how her dying process would play out. The worsening symptoms that she was experiencing, the seizures, the pain at the base of her skull, that not even morphine could alleviate, the inability to sleep for days on end, the nausea, the vomiting. It's amazing what a person can kind of determine, I guess this is my new normal. Well, things were only getting worse. So we moved from our home in California to Portland, Oregon. At that time, there were only 4 states that allowed a terminally ill individual the option of medical aid in dying. Brittany had to find a house for us to rent on Craigslist. She found a new medical team. We had to say goodbye to our friends and family in California. We packed up half of our house into a U-Haul, and then we drive 600 miles north to get to Portland, Oregon. At that point, Brittany then applied for, qualified for, and was finally granted that prescription. And by the way, it was a sleeping medication, and we can get into that in the Q&A. But there was nothing scary about it. And then just 3 weeks before she died, her story received significant media attention. Compassion and Choices posted a video that she had made. The attention that it brought, it crashed CNC's. It crashed their site that day. But the reason that Brittany spoke up is just because she felt it was a huge injustice that we had to leave our home like that. So she spoke up so that no one else, so that none of us would ever have to leave home like she did, like we did. And so I'm skipping a lot of details and other significant events, but for brevity's sake, on the day that Brittany decided that the suffering was only getting worse and she knew that it was her time, within 5 minutes of taking that medication, Brittany fell asleep very gently. Within 30 minutes, her breathing slowed to the point where she passed away. So I held Brittany in my arms as she died peacefully. And that is not, by contrast, the dying process that she would have experienced if that brain tumor would have been allowed to continue to run its course. So now, in keeping my promise to Brittany, I've worked on legislation in states across the country. We are now up to 11 states. And so that is Brittany's story, and that's what brings me here in front of this wonderful group today.
Incredibly powerful, Dan. Thank you so much. So there are people on this call, almost 1,000 people, for many of whom it's a completely new issue. From your experience, tell us a little bit about why we should care about this. How's it relevant? We heard how it's relevant to your life. How is it relevant to others' lives?
And in all honesty, neither Brittany nor I had given this topic much thought. I mean, why would we? We were young newlyweds looking towards a promising future. So, but when chronic illness or disease suddenly punches you in the face, as it did with us, it is that reminder that we are mortal. We all have a beginning, a middle, and an end. We were born, we live this crazy experience called life, and then we all do die. So anyone new to this issue, in Brittany's words, her advice would be to live that life fiercely and fill it with as much adventure as you can. However, take a few moments to think about what you might want at end of life. In most cases, quality hospice and palliative care, where the patient is the focus, most of us are never going to find ourselves in Brittany's predicament. But in those cases where modern medicine cannot keep a person from suffering, the option of medical aid in dying, in Brittany's view, should be afforded to them. And so those were her thoughts, and again, her reason for speaking up and for advocating for this, that this is an issue of autonomy. And I'm glad that when I've traveled, I spent some time in New Mexico working on the legislation back in 2019, and legislators from all stripes, conservatives, progressive, etc., libertarians. A lot of times the message there is that government shouldn't tell us how we live our lives. It certainly is not going to tell us how our final few days on this green earth might play out. And so the message in answering your question is, why should we care about this? How is this relevant to any of our lives? Is that, well, I find that our ability to truly live and embrace day to day, it's so much better, so much more meaningful if we've given just a little bit of thought to our end. Don't be afraid to have these conversations. Share with your loved ones what you would want. Create your advanced healthcare directives. They're very simple things we can do. And I truly think it results in you live a much more robust life as a result. So that would be my advice or reasoning for caring about this issue.
Appreciate that, Dan. We all crave having a meaningful life and leaving a legacy, and you and Brittany have really done your part. I know you have a lot more to do, but thank you so much for the improvements that you're making in the lives of so many. I want to touch on something sort of big picture, and then I want to go right to the laws. Angela Glover runs PolicyLink, a very interesting think and advocacy tank, and she wrote a really powerful article years ago about the curb cut effect, which essentially says, curbs in most areas have a cut in them and a slope, and they have them because people in wheelchairs, disabled people, fought under the law to require it. But what Angela points out is everybody loves a curb cut. People in carriages and anybody in heels, and I won't go on and on about how we all use the curb cut. And she points out that sometimes public policy, which is cast as for a small portion of the population, is actually beneficial for everybody. And that's what I observe going on around the end-of-life care that I'm hearing from you all, particularly the medical aid in dying. As you point out, a huge percentage of us are going to die in circumstances that do not have us knowing and terminally ill and able to work with a doctor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what you're doing, and Representative Armstrong, what you've done in New Mexico, is vastly improving the culture of pain management and care And I quipped about it with you, doctor, about sort of, oh, you actually look at the patient as a human as opposed to a set of tumors. But isn't that what we're doing? Isn't that the, right? Okay, you're nodding your head vigorously. So say a little bit more about how the promulgation of medical aid in dying in the state actually can transform an entire medical system.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, we also made as part of the law that anyone with a terminal illness had to be spoken to about all the options, and anyone that's asking for medical aid in dying has to be spoken to about the options of hospice and palliative care or even continued treatment. It's those conversations. It's the starting of the conversation about how what your options are, how you want to live, how you want to die, and those are all really important. And I will say, by really making hospice a role in the law and acknowledging its role, we have, unlike other states when they've enacted this, we have multiple hospices in New Mexico that are participating fully, all the way up to the medical director prescribing for aid in dying, because they are fully open to the autonomy of the individual and what their choices are for how to live the rest of their life as comfortably and pass as peacefully as possible. And it includes all options. And I think that's enormously important. And I can't tell you the number of people that I've also spoken with who said, just knowing that option is out there gives me enormous peace of mind for myself, for my family. Just knowing if I need it, I can do that. And I just think that that's so enormously important. It really creates, relieves so much anxiety about what the end of life may mean for individuals and families.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what Rep. Armstrong said. There's no question the New Mexico law is better, but even in all of the other laws that have been implemented across the country, what we see is that the implementation of a medical aid in dying law immediately results in the health system, different members of the health system coming together and for the first time really having a conversation about how do you support patients at the end of life. And that has a ripple effect. Even for entities that choose not to support medical aid in dying, they up their game and have better palliative care and better advanced care planning. So it puts pressure on the health system to acknowledge that the patient should have a voice and a choice in the kind of care that they deliver. And we see the evidence in the data. When you look at Oregon, who was the first, in the nation to pass it, there's been studies that have come out, independent studies that have confirmed that medical aid in dying laws have contributed to better enrollment into hospice care, better palliative care training, better pain management. And that's all coming because you now have the patient at the center of the conversations, as opposed to it being a very doctor-centric. It's similar to the childbirth movement, that transformation you saw when women started to ask for a different kind of childbirth experience. That's what's happening at the end of life now. And medical aid in dying is like the baby. It's just the simple way that people are expressing, I want to be in charge of my decisions, but they're not always choosing that as the option. That's the way they're expressing that they want that level of decision-making authority at the end of life.
In the healthcare system, I've been really quickly working with healthcare entities across the state about implementing, and Kim is really right. They're having conversations about their health system and about their delivery of healthcare. They're establishing policies and procedures, referral protocols. It's being integrated into teaching at the university, at the medical school, at the pharmacy school. All of those entities are having these conversations and developing curriculum around it, and developing policies and procedures that were not in place before.
Wow, you're sort of at the vanguard of a transformational change which has been going on, which is to empower adults, patients, with information and data. We saw it. You talked about the childbirth movement, but with HIV and AIDS, heavily gay men, not completely, but heavily a cohort of gay men, educated, entitled, if I'm allowed to say that about myself, demanding from doctors in sort of unheard of ways, what about this? What about this? I've read the protocol, approaching a culture which had basically sort of in many patronizing ways withheld information from patients. Well, I don't know if the family can handle this hard news, particularly women and people of color who were overwhelmingly condescended to. And so you're part of this movement that says maybe the patient has the capacity and the ability to work with people to make her own choices. But that requires data and it requires conversation. So it's amazing what you're doing. Let me take the conversation in a different direction, which is, so everything that you're doing makes sense, certainly to me. I'm a big supporter, but we face opposition. This is sort of not snap your fingers, hey, let's have a more sensible end-of-life care policy. Let's talk a little bit about the opposition and why it's so tough. And then I want to move to what can people do? People are on a call, they're hungry for information, they signed on for a reason. Let's give them tools. But why do you think the opposition is what it is?
Well, I can chime in from the advocacy. I think I've been now to, including the virtual appointments over the past couple of years, I think I'm up to 17 or 18 different state capitals. In person, I was at 14. And in each and every state that I visit, our biggest opponent is always, unfortunately, the Catholic Church. And I say this as a Catholic. I went to Catholic school. I was an altar boy, the whole 9 yards, confirmation, baptism, everything. Support for medical aid in dying nationwide is 72%. Actually, the latest number might be slightly higher than that. Interestingly, support amongst Catholics for medical aid in dying is 70%. So it's right in line with the general public. So while the church leadership, and that's fine, they're entitled to, they can have their opinion. The leadership, they want to be opposed to this, that's fine. But the congregation, the people sitting in the pews, they agree with Brittany. They recognize that this is a medical decision, and one that, after only going through the suffering, the seizures, the pain that she was enduring, that person working within their own set of spiritual beliefs, with the support of their family, with their physicians, that is the only person in that position to make the decisions pertaining to their healthcare. Whether it is pursuing medical aid dying or taking extraordinary measures, and they want the hydration and to be kept on ventilators and everything, whatever that patient, and this was kind of talked about before, this truly is just making healthcare patient-centric, where that individual, in this case the terminally ill individual, that is the only person whose opinion needs to be honored and revered. And so as far as the opponents, as much as they are opposed to it, in Brittany's words, it's like, well, I refuse to suffer because of somebody else's faith. If they are to find themselves in her predicament and they don't want to pursue medical aid and dying for themselves, that's real easy. They would simply never pursue it. They would never avail themselves of it. The strength of this legislation, and again, these are her words, is that it's a choice. It is an option. It is an option that a person decides that they want to have the conversations and maybe include that as something that they might want or need to, depending on how their suffering goes, need to utilize. But I have yet to find an argument posed by the opposition that stands up to any debate with Brittany or any terminally ill individual, because the strength of this being an option. So it is, and so thank you, by the way, because hosting things like this gets the word out, makes people aware, and in many cases, remembering Brittany's story is like, wait, that's what this is about? Well, I'm in favor of that too. So thanks for this opportunity to bring together so many individuals watching this so that they understand what this legislation, what this program really does.
I think one of the important things to keep in mind also from a medical perspective that it is a medical practice and it really should be normalized and standardized in medicine as an option to other end-of-life choices that are being offered to our patients. There's no reason that we offer one choice versus the other. I think it comes down again to people willing to let go some of the control on their end and allow patients to have that little bit of dignity and autonomy in making choices that they would like for themselves, especially at this stage, at the very terminal last stages or last few days of their life.
Thank you so much. This is very rich. I do want to sort of have the last segment be about what people can do. But Dan, you remind me. I worked in Congress for a long time, and when the House Judiciary Committee tried to ban the practice in Oregon at the federal level, the chairman of the committee was Henry Hyde, who was an esteemed member of Illinois. And he was a friend, and he supported me at my Senate confirmation hearing. He testified on my behalf, even though we were not in the same party. But he talked about why he wanted to ban the practice of what we would now call medical aid in dying in terms of his wife's death and her suffering and pain. And he equated her to Jesus. And I sat during that hearing and thought, I have tremendous respect for you and the love that you have for your wife. I love the Lord. I'm a churchgoer. I can't believe that I'm sitting in the Congress of the United States of America and that the stated rationale to restrict how a suffering person can make choices about her life is going to be the Lord and Savior. But that's in part what animates it. And I have tremendous respect for that point of view. And I believe that people who feel that way ought to have the choice to control their own fate. But that's different than legislating your fate. And that's regrettably where we are. There are other objections, but I think the one you've named is the central. But let's talk about we're on the move. It's a movement that has actually persuaded the vast majority of Americans that it's the right way to go. Representative Armstrong's work demonstrates that. Kim, you preside over the central organization that is changing laws in state after state, but also medical establishments, medical schools, curriculums, et cetera. What can people do?
There is a whole lot that people can do. So first of all, I just want to reiterate what you said, Robert, which is that this is a movement that has been successful because people have brought forward their time, their talents, their resources, and come together. It's courageous people like Brittany and Dan coming forward and sharing their story. Rep. Armstrong and her daughter, Erin, were incredibly powerful. It's those stories that make the biggest difference in being able to move legislation. So quite simply, go to Compassion and Choices website, compassionandchoices.org. And there's a host of ways that you can get involved. You can volunteer in your state at the grassroots level if you want to get involved in a manner like that. If you're a medical provider, we have a Doctors for Dignity program. That's another way you can get involved. One of the things that we have done that has been very instrumental in being able to move laws is have doctor advocates work to get their medical societies to drop their opposition to medical aid in dying or adopt engaged neutral positions. And that work all takes place from the doctors themselves, and that they're the ones that have, the credibility. If you are a faith leader, we have a Faith Leaders for Choice group that you can be involved in. We have 4 different leadership councils: African American, LGBTQ, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Alaskan, and then we have Latino. So we have 4 advisory groups. We have a group of executive volunteers, which are people that have some other skill that they want to bring forward, and we work with them to figure out how to tap into their expertise and skill. But the simplest thing to do to get started is to go to our website. And that's, of course, how you get started if you want to help to advance laws across the country and move this work, both on the implementation side, because we also do work to ensure that laws are implemented, as well as on the passage side. So truly, and then of course, resources are needed as well. So if you don't want to volunteer, but you want to contribute resources, that's what funds all of the work that allows us to keep things moving.
Others?
I'll say, I want to reiterate, it's stories, it's telling your stories, it's talking personally to your legislators. We did many of the things in New Mexico that Kim's talked about. We worked on the grassroots level, getting local communities, local city councils, even to pass resolutions. Did a lot of work talking to individual constituents, talking to their legislators. And then we, with Compassionate Choices Help, we published stories and videos of people telling the stories and people that others would know. And it's I think that's what really moves people, is those stories, and they can relate to them because most everyone knows about someone in their own family, in their own community, who they were close to, who has died, who has had cancer, who has suffered. And I can't stress enough that telling your story is powerful.
Yeah. If I can just add two other things that I forgot, is that on the implementation side, we need doctors, nurses, social workers. We do a lot of presentations. We work with the local state groups to help implement the laws, change hospice policies. So anyone who works or is connected to the health system in any way can often be helpful on the implementation side. And then the other thing that's really important is our website has a Plan Your Care section. And even if you don't want to get involved in the broader movement, I would really encourage people to go check out the Plan Your Care website. It also links you back to your state forms so you can fill out your advance directives. We have a dementia values and priorities tool. I saw in the chat some people were really concerned about dementia, understandably. I would check out our dementia values and priorities tool. So there's a whole host of resources. And, Dan spoke to, you can be any age and have something happen to you that you're not expecting. And so it doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, it's worth you spending some time looking at the Plan Your Care section. In my household, you turn 18 and we wish you a happy birthday and you fill out your advance directive.
I think from a clinician and educator perspective, I really think education about end-of-life care and medical aid in dying is also something that we need to start early, not only start them. We need to start this in the medical school level, make it part of the curriculum, right, and then enforce it in really all residencies across all specialties, because unlike the misconception a lot of people have is that end-of-life care and medical aided dying is something that's encountered just by hospice and palliative physicians, that's not true, because all physicians and all medical clinicians should be really very well versed in discussing end-of-life care with their patients, regardless of which discipline they come from.
So we are coming to a close. Thank you for that, Doctor. We are coming to a close. I'm going to give everybody sort of a couple of sentences if you'd like. Folks on this call are animated. They're motivated. They came to learn, and they did. What do you want to leave us with? I'll wait till you're done. Dan, what do you want to leave us with?
I guess mine is simple. The passage of this legislation in more states, it does not result in more people dying. It simply results in fewer people suffering. That's what this bill's about. That's what this program does, because these people are, by definition, to qualify, terminally ill. They are dying. And so it just affords them that little bit of say of how things might go for them.
Representative?
I would say that this law is about having compassion and validating the dignity and the ability for people to make their own decisions about how they live, what kind of medical care, and it will change the system for the better regardless of whether you ever want to use medical aid in dying yourself or ever in the situation to do that. It will help improve the end of life caring for everyone.
Excellent. Doctor?
I think we're all going to die, so I think it's really important for us all to start the conversation around end-of-life care in general with not just our families, but with our colleagues and our friends, as well as conversations around medical aid in dying, so that we can actually bring this movement to the forefront even more so. And I would really highly say that highly encourage everyone to get involved in organizations such as CNC that really help educate you and show you where you can go to if you need the resources in your state.
All about it. And President Kim?
So I would say, first of all, there was a lot of unanswered questions. I always hate leaving unanswered, but they tell you leave them wanting more. So maybe it's a good thing. But on our website, if you go under what we do, there is a link for medical aid in dying that gives you like the basic facts. So I would encourage maybe one of the staff can enter that into the chat box. That's a great resource. It answers a lot of the questions that came up that we didn't get to. But then the thing that I want to leave you with is that if you are looking for an issue that matters, where you can make a difference, we're your issue. Come join us in this. We have everything is lined up for us to make sustained, profound change in how somebody dies. We've got the baby boomers retiring. They're watching their loved ones dying, unfortunate, tragic deaths. The COVID pandemic has really brought the end of life into the limelight and why it's important that people have some level of dignity at the end and why closure matters to people at the end of life. And then you've got people contemplating their own mortality. We've authorized 7 states in 7 years at a time when very little is taking place in state legislatures across the country. You know, ours is an issue that while it is very controversial for a few, it unites the vast majority of people. And we are making profound change in this country, not just for the few people who want the option, but for everybody. The entire way end-of-life care is delivered. So I hope that some of you are inspired to join us because our change will continue as our movement grows and more people get involved. And there is a way that everybody can be involved in this change, from small little acts to being much more involved and playing a more sizable role. So I hope to see some of you after this reaching out to us and letting us know you're interested in getting more involved.
And the questions in the chat mean that we need to do this again, which we will. So thank you, leaders, elected officials, activists, doctors. Each one of you has a vision. Each one of you has a passion and a commitment to make the lives of Americans stronger and safer and more free. God bless you. And in a sign that we are a sophisticated and mature movement, we have a song, actually an original song with the Harlem Gospel Choir featuring soloist Carmen Ruby Floyd. If you can stick around for another 60 seconds, I think you'll leave on a really memorable note. Thank you all. God bless you for the work you do. Stick around for the original song from the Harlem Gospel Choir.
You're busy, we get it, but you want us to kiss and get a head start. The end isn't written in stone or a poem or in an opinion. Let's start the conversation. It's all about your vision. Take a second and listen to the rhythm of choice, 'cause it's your decision to know your options, to know your position. Let's start the conversation. This is your show. Before the curtains close, before the lights go low, you're gonna take control. You're awake right now. When you take your bow, you're gonna sing out loud. This is my life. You have the option to write your last chapter, to breathe a bit better, to capture the factors that matter most to you and yours. Focus on the things that matter. Once you have written it, they can understand it. You'll never be gladder. Focus on the things that matter. This is your show. Before the lights go low, you're gonna take control. You're awake right now. When you take your bow, you're gonna sing out loud. This is my life. You're running a mile a minute. Who is it? We're cramming so much in it. Take a cosmic second to think about it, to dream about it. If you wanna leave a legacy, from now until then it's your option to leave the way you lived, with purpose and direction and reconnection. If you're gonna leave a legacy, this is the show. Before the curtains close, before the lights go low, you're gonna take control. You're awake right now. When you take your bow, you're gonna sing out loud. This is my life. The perfect show. We don't dream how the curtains will close. A finale of our own in shimmering lights. As they fade, we're still cheering tonight. It's my right. Hey. Take the drama out the death. Take the breath. Take a second. Make another choice. Listen to your voice. Take control. You're awake right now, so take your bow and sing out loud. This is my life. Take the drama out of death. Take a breath, take a second. Make another choice. Listen to your voice, take control. You're awake right now, so take your bow and sing out loud. This is my life. Before the curtains close, before the lights go low, you're gonna take control. You're awake right now, so take your bow and sing out loud. Finish strong, finish feeling, finish proud. This is my song. Before the curtains close, before the lights go low, you're gonna take control. You're awake right now, so take your bow and sing out loud. This is